Bob decided to walk home along the riverbank, lost in thought. "Well, that's it, Bob," he muttered to himself. "You're unemployed now. And the worst part is, you were fired for nothing. They blew the whole thing up, accused you of bribery and abuse of power." He wasn't in a hurry to get home. His wife had made it clear she didn't need him. He knew she'd found someone rich, someone who could give her the life she wanted. What could he, Bob Miller, a therapist at the non-profit community clinic, offer her? The clinic barely made ends meet, let alone paid a competitive salary. But he loved his job, helping those who couldn't afford mental health care. Now the board had replaced the old director with Glenn, a man who talked about efficiency and the bottom line, not patience. These innovations were agonizing for the doctors and staff. At Glenn's behest, nurses and paramedics now ran around like chickens with their heads cut off, scrambling to fulfill his latest whim. One day it was planting a flower bed outside the ward windows. The next it was creating a wall of fame with staff photos and bios. Glenn's obsession with appearances was deafening, echoing through the hospital corridors. Meanwhile, he seemed to have forgotten the most important thing: treating the patients. If everyone was focused on beautifying the ward for the next inspection, who was actually providing care? Bob tried to voice his concerns, but Glenn just scribbled something in his notebook and gave Bob a condescending look. 2 days later, Bob was fired. It was all because of a supposed bribe caught on a hidden camera Glenn had secretly installed in his office. "Oh, why did this happen? It's so humiliating. I'll never live this down," Bob whispered, his eyes welling up. There was no bribe. "How did it come to this?" he sighed, gazing at the river. It flowed on, indifferent and cold to the everyday struggles of the townsfolk. Suddenly, in the fading twilight, he noticed 2 hunched figures on the riverbank. At first it didn't seem unusual. The riverbank was public. Anyone could swim, fish, or just enjoy the scenery. But for some reason he was intrigued. Bob, not wanting to, found himself distracted from his own troubles, his attention drawn to the strangers. What could they be doing on the shore at dusk? Bob wondered. It's odd, fishermen, but they wouldn't be walking around in the dark. Where are their lanterns or a campfire? It just doesn't make sense. As Bob squinted, he realized it was a man and a woman. Their car, a large SUV, was parked about 100 yards from the water's edge. In the dim light, he couldn't make out the colour. Definitely not fishermen, he thought. Noticing Bob, the couple seemed startled and began speaking in a strange tongue. It sounded familiar, though. Bob had always loved languages, translating foreign books in his spare time. People had joked he should have been an interpreter, but he'd wanted to be a doctor. Bob was taken aback. They're foreigners, he realised. What could they be doing here? Curiosity got the better of him, and he slowed down, trying to eavesdrop on the mysterious couple. As a language enthusiast, he was eager to hear what they were saying. His non-threatening appearance seemed to put them at ease, and they continued their conversation. They had lowered their voices, but Bob could still make out snippets of their discussion. "Stone. Where can I find a stone, German?" the woman grumbled. "I told you we should have brought the weight in the car." "Come on, we'll figure something out," the man, who was clearly younger than his companion, replied. "We could collect sand in a bag. There's plenty of it on the shore. That'll be heavy enough." Bob assumed they could be mother and son. The conversation Bob overheard sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't that anything particularly threatening had been said, but their furtive movements and whispered tones raised his suspicions. They probably assumed their conversation was private, not knowing Bob was multilingual. Bob walked past them, intentionally heading towards their SUV. To his surprise, the trunk was open, and a faint light glowed from inside the car. A driver sat behind the wheel, listening to quiet music. From a distance, Bob couldn't see much in the trunk besides a long, rolled-up object that resembled a canvas or carpet. Initially, he thought it might be a fishing net, but as he got closer, he realized it was a blanket, and it was moving. Panic surged through him. He glanced back. The couple was preoccupied with their activities on the shore, oblivious to his presence. Bob crept closer and cautiously pulled back the blanket. His heart sank. Underneath was a girl, barely conscious, mumbling incoherently and clearly in shock. Bob didn't hesitate. He gently took her hand and hurried towards the nearest bushes, knowing he had to act fast. The moment those foreigners realized she was gone, they'd come looking for her. "Shh, shh, just be quiet," Bob whispered, pushing through the bushes. But as soon as he reached the edge of the thicket, a furious shout erupted behind him in plain English. "Hey, stop! Who are you talking to?" Bob froze. He knew something terrible had happened on the shore. Thankfully, the girl's limp body made it easier to carry her, and fear lent him strength. He didn't know if the couple was armed, but he couldn't risk it. Now he understood what they meant by stones. They were planning something horrific. Peering through the foliage, Bob scanned his surroundings, keeping to the trees for cover. He heard a crackle behind him, the sound of the pursuers crashing through the underbrush. He needed to get to the highway, only about 100 yards away, where he could flag down a car, but he'd have to cross an open field. The voices were getting closer. Bob's heart pounded, sweat dripping down his face. All he could think about was saving this girl. He knew the pursuers were closing in. He'd have to fight them or give up. Then a stroke of luck. A car pulled off the highway, loud music blaring. A group of young people got out looking for a place to camp. They'd probably head down to the riverbank, Bob figured. This diversion confused his pursuers, who stopped and turned back to their car. Bob wished he'd gotten their license plate, but saving the girl was more important. Once they were alone, Bob used his last bit of strength to reach the foreigner's car. Seeing him, a tall man in glasses carrying an unconscious girl, the young people grew alarmed. "Hey man, what happened? Need help?" one asked. Bob took a deep breath. "Yes, I do. Could you give me a ride home? It's close. I'll pay you, I promise." "Don't worry about it, hop in. We just need to unload our gear, then we'll take you." The driver said, "Guys, hold off on setting up camp. We're going night fishing." 10 minutes later, they were on the highway. Bob didn't want to take the girl to the hospital. As a doctor, he saw no physical injuries. She might just be drunk or drugged. He could give her an IV drip at home to cleanse her blood. He'd done it before for his late mother, who'd been ill for years. Luckily, Bob's wife, Amy, was already gone when he got home. She'd packed her things and moved in with her new boyfriend, a businessman. Bob didn't envy him. The world of commerce and entrepreneurship was foreign to him. His passions were medicine and languages, sometimes even combining the two by translating medical texts from Latin. Bob struggled to unlock the door, then carried the girl inside and laid her on the couch. He washed his hands and prepared an IV drip. By this time, the girl was regaining consciousness, but still disoriented. "Easy, easy," Bob soothed her. "Just lie still. This will make you feel better." He expertly inserted the IV, finally able to relax. The solution contained a sedative which would help her sleep. Bob knew sleep was the best medicine in situations like this. Since he didn't smell alcohol, he assumed she'd been drugged. He sat down and watched the solution drip slowly into her vein. Before he knew it, he was lost in troubled thoughts, reliving the events of the day. It had started normally enough, with patients coming in, Bob examining them, giving recommendations and writing prescriptions. Among them was Nancy, an elderly woman Bob had known since school. She'd been his foreign language teacher, inspiring his love for translation. "Good morning, Bobby," she'd said, coughing. "This cough is back. Must be spring. My body's weak, and I asked for you specifically at the front desk. I don't want to see anyone else." Bob had smiled at her. "Oh, Nancy, that's not necessary," Bob said. "If it gets worse, see another doctor. Don't wait." "And a doctor can't be bad by default. We're taught in school that the patient's health comes first. Everything else is secondary." Nancy smiled, then rummaged in her purse and pulled out an old, worn book with a foreign title. Bob's face lit up. "You still remember? Thank you so much. I love reading books in their original language." His genuine joy brought tears to Nancy's eyes. Take it. I have no use for it anymore. My children and grandchildren certainly don't. With all these new gadgets, who needs translators? Soon my profession will be obsolete." Bob waved her off. "Oh, Nancy, don't say that. Machines can't replace people. You're a natural teacher. Your lessons always warmed my soul." They chatted a bit longer. Then Bob examined her with his stethoscope. He knew her illness wasn't serious, but it needed attention. Left untreated, it could lead to complications. Nancy had become like a mother to him. They didn't live together, but whenever they met, they reminisced about the past, when Bob was just starting to learn about languages. Nancy considered him one of her best students. "You know, Bobby," she'd said, wiping away a tear, "I've taught many, but never met a talent like you. You could translate on the fly. I gave you the most difficult texts to challenge you, but you always exceeded my expectations." Bob nodded in gratitude as he wrote out a prescription for inexpensive medication. He always knew the budget-friendly alternatives to costly drugs. "Oh, thank you, Bobby," Nancy said, wiping a tear. "I felt so awful I thought I'd need an ambulance, but I took a pill and made it through the night. Then I came straight to you, and I brought you this book as a little gift." After she left, Bob put the book in his desk drawer, planning to look at it later. It had been a busy day. He'd barely had a moment to catch his breath. The office nurse was out sick, so Bob had to handle extra tasks, including retrieving test results. He knew Glenn was doing this on purpose, trying to show him who was boss. Finally, during his lunch break, the waiting room was empty. "That's it for today," Bob thought. "Now I can catch up on paperwork." But before he could sit down, Glenn stormed into his office with 2 police officers. Bob felt a knot in his stomach. "Something wrong, Glenn?" he asked. Glenn scowled. "Not at all, Bob. Show me the contents of your desk. Yes, that book you're hiding on the shelf." Confused, Bob retrieved Nancy's gift and handed it to Glenn. Glenn laughed. No, you open it. Let everyone see what's inside." Bob's hands shook as he opened the book. Severonical large bills were tucked inside. "Looks like a bribe, Doc," one of the officers said, starting to write a report. "But it's not mine," Bob protested. "This book was a gift." "How could I have known what was inside?" Bob muttered, but Glenn just shook his head. "Don't play dumb, Bob. We've had our eye on you. I recently installed a hidden camera in your office, so I saw the old lady give you the book. Clever move hiding the money there. But we're not stupid. 2 and 2 makes 4, you know." "What are you talking about?" Bob was losing his cool. "What moves?" Glenn, drunk on power, acted as if Bob was already convicted. Bob knew it was a setup, an elaborate act, and he was the star of the show. The therapist caught red-handed with a bribe hidden in a foreign language book. "Nancy couldn't have put money in there. Where would a pensioner get that kind of cash?" Bob pleaded. "Glenn, this is all you, isn't it? Just be honest." Glenn dismissed him. "Don't shift blame, Bob. You're guilty, so be ready to face the consequences. But don't worry, we won't lock you up just yet. You're not a criminal in the traditional sense. Be prepared for court, though, and I advise you not to leave town." One of the officers nodded. Bob's world crumbled around him. His entire life flashed before his eyes. School, college, medical school, and this was the result? Accused of a crime he didn't commit. Within an hour, Glenn fired him, effective immediately. "Sorry, but I had to protect my department," Glenn said. "And as for the camera, that was my personal initiative. I'm keeping an eye on everyone now with the hospital director's full support." "We've found so many violations this week, it's time for a major clean-up," Glenn said. "Don't count on me, though. I'll clear my name. There was no bribe." Glenn smirked. "What difference does it make? The fact that you had that much cash says you're a criminal. Besides, the camera clearly shows the patient handing you the book. So prepare for court and get a good lawyer. Frankly, I don't want to see you go down. You're a decent doctor, even if I didn't particularly like you. Have faith, Bob." Bob clenched his teeth, but didn't respond. He trudged out of the office, leaving his shift unfinished. At home, another blow awaited him. Amy, his wife, was sitting on packed suitcases. "What's going on? Are you going somewhere?" Bob asked, stunned. Amy smiled bitterly. "Yes, Bob, I'm leaving. I'm leaving your life for good. I'm tired of scraping by, waiting for things to get better. I want vacations, nice things, a life you can't give me." Bob sat down heavily. He didn't have the energy to argue. He knew she was leaving, and it was for good. This had been brewing for a long time. Amy had started complaining 6 months into their marriage. "You only care about your books," she'd said. "You should have taken that job at the private clinic. You spend all your time translating. Don't you have any hobbies?" Bob had tried to explain, but Amy wasn't interested. It seemed she'd been planning this for a while. Soon, a sleek dark green car arrived to pick Amy up. A well-dressed man stepped out, but didn't enter the house. Bob would have gladly thrown him down the stairs, but Amy handled it herself, lugging her heavy suitcases to the car. Bob realized she'd taken all their valuables, including his wedding ring and the small gold cross he'd inherited from his mother. He'd never cared for jewellery, keeping it in a box, dreaming of passing it on to his children. But Amy hadn't been interested in starting a family. "We'll have plenty of time for that," she'd say. "We need to focus on our own lives first. This house is old, the car is a clunker." Bob had bought that car for her, so she could easily get to her office job. And this was how she repaid him. With a court case looming, he felt utterly lost. He sank back into the chair. The girl on the couch stirred, trying to turn over but too weak to ask for help. She fell back asleep. "Well, I guess I'm on my own," Bob whispered. He could call an ambulance, but then he'd have to explain where he'd found her. With the bribery charge hanging over him, they might accuse him of attempted murder. "No," he decided. "I'll handle this myself. I've seen worse. I've had patients on the brink of death brought in, and they leave the hospital alive and well." Bob stayed up all night watching over the girl. He woke with a start to find her standing before him, looking at him curiously. "Good morning," he said cautiously. "Feeling better?" She shrugged. "I guess, but I don't know what happened." "Temporary amnesia," Bob explained. "It's common after taking certain drugs or accidental poisoning. Don't worry, I'll give you another IV and get you some medicine." The girl looked at Bob with genuine surprise. "Excuse me, but you're just going to treat me. Who are you? Do you even know what you're doing? What if you make it worse?" Bob smiled. "I'm a therapist from the local hospital, and I won't harm you. I was walking along the river last night and saw some foreigners acting strangely. Then I saw you in their SUV. I grabbed you and ran. Some kind folks gave me a ride." The girl's cheeks flushed. "Oh my God, what happened? A river, an SUV, foreigners? Who am I? Am I a foreigner too?" "Don't worry," Bob reassured her. "Your memory will return. It's just the drugs in your system. The IV will flush them out, then you'll feel better. In the meantime, relax. Would you like some breakfast?" She nodded, then added, "Can I cook? I feel this urge to be in the kitchen. Maybe I was a chef in my past life." Bob chuckled. "Maybe, but I doubt it. You look more like an office worker. Besides, most restaurant chefs are men." "True," she agreed, heading to the kitchen. Opening the refrigerator, she was struck by the Spartan contents. Bob's wife hadn't been a cook, so he'd mostly lived on frozen meals and instant noodles. Amy spent her days at the office, eating breakfast, lunch, and often dinner at the fancy cafe downstairs. Amy didn't give Bob a second thought. "If you want to eat, cook for yourself," she'd always said. "It's not my fault you can't afford takeout." In her eyes, a man who couldn't provide for himself and his wife was weak or stupid. Money was everything to Amy. "You don't have much here," the girl remarked, rummaging through the cupboards. She found a few potatoes and some eggs, which she fried up. The aroma of cooking filled the house. "Smells delicious," Bob said, giving her a thumbs up. "Thanks," she replied. "I could do much better with more ingredients, but I made do with what I found." Bob hesitated, then asked, "How should I address you? I know you've lost your memory, but maybe we can come up with a temporary name." The girl thought for a moment. "I like the name Veronica. It's probably not my real name, but let's go with it. And call me Veronica, not Miss—" Bob smiled and nodded. While Ashley served the food, he made instant coffee and sat down at the table. Warmth spread through him, and tears welled up in his eyes. He and Amy had rarely eaten together. They never had breakfast, lunch, or dinner as a family. Bob had always dreamed of that, of having a family gathered around the table like when he was a child. "This is delicious. You're a great cook. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe you're a chef, you could definitely work in a restaurant," Bob smiled. Veronica remained silent, lost in thought. She was worried about what had happened. She could go to the police, but what could she tell them? How did she end up on the riverbank with those foreigners? She felt entangled in a dark plot, and feared involving the police would only make things worse. So she accepted Bob's offer to stay with him for a while. To break the silence, he turned on the small kitchen TV. It was showing the local news. The anchor spoke about road repairs, replacing heating pipes, and cutting down old trees. It was all mundane until the anchor switched to the main story. Bob barely paid attention, but Veronica dropped her fork and stared at the screen with tears in her eyes. The anchor announced that a businessman and philanthropist, Oliver Martin, had returned to the country after years abroad. He was supposedly here for a charitable cause, but the details were unclear. "What's wrong, Veronica?" Bob asked, concerned by her reaction. "Why did this news upset you so much?" She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. I think I know this man." "My memory's coming back slowly," Veronica said. "I'm Veronica Lewis. I'm a lawyer at a private firm." Bob raised his eyebrows in surprise. "A lawyer? We were guessing you worked in a restaurant." "Alejandro?" Veronica trailed off, then pressed her fingers to her temples, hoping to stimulate her memory. "I still don't remember much, but I know my name and the name of this client who came to see me. I saw the news report and it all came flooding back." "So you know this millionaire Martin?" Bob asked. Veronica nodded. "Yes, he was definitely my client. He asked me for help as soon as he arrived." "Interesting. What connected you two?" "I remember this much," Veronica said. "Martin asked me to find someone. The woman's name was written in a notebook, but the notebook's gone. The details are hazy." "Why doesn't it all come back at once?" Veronica asked. "Why in bits and pieces?" "Don't worry," Bob said, patting her shoulder. "It might take a week or longer for a full recovery, But you've made progress, remembering your name, profession, and even this Martin guy. Maybe you should go to your office to see what you can find out. I can come with you if you'd like." Veronica hesitated. "Would that be all right? It could take a while, and what about your job?" The doctor sighed sadly and waved his hand dismissively. "I'm sorry I didn't tell the whole truth right away. I was fired. It's embarrassing to admit, but they framed me for bribery, which I didn't take. They set me up." He paused, looking down. "So, I went to the river. I thought about diving into the stream and not coming back. You know, like an ostrich burying its head in the sand. I wanted to hide from my problems underwater. Stupid, of course." "Why is it stupid? Anything can happen in life. As a lawyer, I've seen a lot, but I can't discuss specifics, you know. Professional ethics." Veronica paused, her expression softening. "Thank you very much for your help, Bob. I'm very grateful to you, and I'm sure you were simply deceived." Perhaps those words weren't enough for Bob at that moment. But from Veronica's lips, they felt like a real balm for his heart and soul. Anyways, Bob had an idea. He suggested they walk around town in search of her law firm. Veronica's memory still refused to divulge details about her life and work before the riverbank incident. Bob had the addresses of all the law firms in town and suggested they visit each one, hoping to jog Veronica's memory. Since walking was difficult, he offered to take a taxi. He could have used Amy's car, but he refused to touch anything that belonged to her after her betrayal. Hiring a taxi turned out to be a good decision. As soon as Veronica got in, the driver turned around and said, "Veronica? Is that you? Why aren't you in your own car? Forgive my curiosity, but I'm so grateful to you. You saved me from a false accusation. You found the evidence from the traffic cameras that cleared my name. My opponents were crushed in court, so your rides are on me. Wherever you need to go, just say the word." Veronica looked at Bob in amazement. "Well, then take me to work, please." The driver nodded and started the engine. Veronica had inadvertently found out where she worked. Chaos reigned at the law firm. They'd been searching for her for hours, desperately trying to reach her by phone. Bob didn't know what was happening, but he could see Veronica was in trouble. "Listen, I don't know how you run things here," Bob said, "but Veronica is in serious trouble. Someone tried to harm her, and she's lost part of her memory. She needs a hospital." The boss looked unimpressed. "Who are you, and why are you throwing around medical terms?" "I'm a doctor, a therapist at the local hospital. You can check. My name is Bob Miller." The boss's eyes widened. "Miller? As in the Johnson case?" He waved his hands dismissively. "No need, I believe you. Veronica, get well soon. I'll give your cases to Catherine. She's good. Once you're recovered, we'll reschedule those court hearings. Take care." Veronica looked at Bob gratefully. He'd saved her twice in 2 days. First from an attack, now from her overbearing boss. They entered her office. Veronica sifted through the papers on her desk, trying to piece together the day before the incident. Bob stood beside her, observing. The office was minimalist but tasteful, with a large aquarium in the corner and a plasma TV on the wall. "So that's it," Veronica exclaimed, clutching her head. "Those bastards! I wondered why they wanted to meet me in a cafe. It wasn't a cafe at all, it was a biker bar." Bob gently guided her to a chair. "Easy, easy. What happened, Veronica? Take your time." She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "It was those clients who came with Oliver Martin. The businessman personally asked me to find a woman named Natalie Olson. So I was looking for her," Veronica said, "and it turns out this couple had arranged a meeting with me. The man's name was Herman, and the woman was Martha." Bob frowned. "What did you say the woman's name was? Olson?" "Yes," Veronica said, pointing to a note on her desk. "Natalie Olson. Why? Bob's jaw dropped. Natalie Olson. That's my mother's name, but she died 2 years ago. Veronica stared at him, bewildered. Bob nodded slowly, a sense of unease washing over him. He had a feeling that meeting this millionaire, Martin, would change his life forever. Maybe this Oliver Martin was even his father, the faceless figure from his childhood drawings. Could he, Bob, become a millionaire overnight? It seemed too fantastical to be true, yet the thought excited him. Who wouldn't dream of sudden wealth? It took Veronica a few minutes to find Martin's number in her work notebook. With a triumphant cry, she dialed it on the landline. But luck wasn't on their side. Martin's assistant, Alejandro, answered. Yes, regarding the boss's request, Veronica said. What do you mean he's in the hospital? Okay, I'll be coming to see him. She hung up and looked at Bob. Martin is in the hospital. We need to hurry, Bob. Would you mind driving? My car is in the parking lot, the one that looks like wet asphalt. Bob agreed without hesitation. As he got behind the wheel of the luxury car, he couldn't help but feel a pang of playful envy. He'd only ever been able to afford a used car for his wife. Lawyers make good money, huh? He remarked, glancing at Veronica, trying to lighten the mood. I bet you have a mansion. Veronica laughed. No mansion, just a regular house. And I'm still paying off the car loan. Well, you need to keep up appearances, Veronica explained. I couldn't show up to a business meeting in a clunker, so I took out a loan. Not all lawyers are rolling in money, you know. Bob started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. So why did this Oliver Martin guy come to you? You're a lawyer, not a private investigator. I specialize in criminal cases, Veronica replied. So I have connections in the police. Martin knew I wouldn't betray his confidence. Private detectives are unpredictable, you know. Whoever pays more gets their loyalty, but a lawyer has to operate within the law. Ah, I see, Bob nodded. At the hospital, they were met by Martin's security guard, a burly man in a suit who quickly searched them for weapons before leading them to Martin's room. Martin was awake, and the sight of Veronica brought a smile to his face. Veronica, welcome. I assume this is a serious matter. Veronica nodded. Yes, Mr. Martin. I found Natalie Olson. She passed away 2 years ago. This is her son, Bob Miller. Miller? Martin asked, intrigued. Maybe she gave him a relative's last name. Veronica shrugged. I'm not sure why, but I think you'll know better. Martin looked at Bob with interest. Bob felt uneasy, anticipating the inevitable question. He's going to say I'm his son, Bob thought. Why else would he be looking for my mother? He felt a strange pull towards this man, a yearning for the truth. Martin's lips trembled as he beckoned Bob closer. Tears welled up in his eyes. Son, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I have something important to tell you. Forgive me for taking so long to find you. Don't judge me too harshly, but I had my reasons. Bob felt a surge of tension. He looked the rich man in the eye and said, You're my father, aren't you? I saw the resemblance the moment I walked in. Silence filled the room. The businessman closed his eyes and said softly, No, Bob, you're not my son. I had nothing to do with your mother. It's a different story. Your real father was Victor Stevens, and he died abroad a few years ago. Bob instinctively recoiled. How did he die? What was he doing abroad? The businessman coughed, then continued. His competitors were after him. He didn't have a formal relationship with your mother, so to protect her, he fled the country and hid his assets in a foreign bank. I was an immigrant then, working as a janitor. Victor and I became friends. One day he confided in me about his past, and I promised to help. But I didn't get the chance. Your father died, Bob, in a car accident. It might have been deliberate, I don't know. But before he died, he gave me the account information and passwords." "Just like that?" Bob asked, sceptical. "Yes, just like that. He made me rich. I hid for a few years, then started to legitimize the money. I invested, got married, had a son, Herman. That's how I lived. But recently I realized it wasn't right. I had to find Victor's fiancée, Natalie Olson, and give her the money. I didn't know she'd passed away and that you existed." Tears streamed down Bob's face. He'd hoped for anything but this. He had even been ready to accept this half-paralyzed man as his father, to embrace him. But now he realized that it wasn't the money he craved. It was the feeling of not being alone, of having someone who cared for him. While Bob and Martin talked, Veronica stepped into the hallway and called for Martin's head of security. In a tense conversation, Veronica told Alejandro how Martha and Herman had tried to kill her at a roadside cafe. Their motive? Fear that Martin would leave everything to Natalie Olson and her son. Veronica was an unwitting victim, caught in the crossfire because of valuable information she hadn't yet shared with Martin. If Martha and Herman succeeded in drowning her, Martin would never know about Natalie and her son, Bob. Upon learning of his wife and stepson's actions, Martin had them brought to a notary to rewrite his will. He didn't involve the police, but he did file for divorce and named Bob as his heir. Martin didn't expect to live much longer and wanted to fulfill his promise to Victor Stevens. As it turned out, Herman and Martha had inadvertently punished themselves. Fleeing the scene, they'd gotten into a car accident. Martha sustained minor injuries, but Herman was severely injured and might be disabled for life. Despite this, Martin still included them in his will, ensuring they wouldn't be left destitute. Feeling a mix of disappointment and gratitude, Bob thanked Martin and went outside to sit on a bench. Veronica joined him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry," she said. "It's better than nothing. You didn't get to meet your father, but at least you know where his grave is. And you're a wealthy man now." "A wealthy man with a ruined reputation," Bob muttered. "Listen," Veronica said. "Tell me about your problems. Maybe I can help. It's my specialty." Bob recounted his ordeal, and Veronica listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. "This sounds like a classic setup," she concluded. "Forgive my legal jargon, but I think your teacher was used as a pawn. I'll try to prove it, so don't worry." Bob smiled weakly. "I don't know if it'll work. They have it all on camera. It's hard to argue with that." Veronica smiled mysteriously. "Just give me some time." Throughout the investigation, Veronica proved to be a true professional, supporting Bob every step of the way. She ensured the case wouldn't be dismissed before trial, and her instincts proved correct. It turned out that Nancy's neighbour had planted the money in the book, knowing she intended to give it to Bob. Bob's name was cleared, and he was offered his job back at the clinic. But he declined. He had bigger plans now. With the inheritance from his father, he could finally open his own practice, providing affordable mental health care to those in need. As for Bob and Veronica, they found solace and companionship in each other's company. They started dating, their bond forged in a crucible of shared adversity. Bob finally had the family he'd always dreamed of, albeit in a different form than he'd imagined. Loved this video? Then subscribe and let's dive into more incredible life stories together.